Okay. Okay, well, I'll try to move around here and not get in the way of my own slides. That would be good. Anyway, yes, I'm delighted to be here. And yes, the talk will be on generative social science and Agent Zero, who I see as an alternative to the rational actor model, as I'll explain. But first, let's see. This is not this. This is this.
Working?
It might work.
Click.
Okay.
Right on. Okay.
Ah, good. Yes. So I wanted to acknowledge how honored I am to be here with you. I'm here all month as a visiting professor, and I'm looking forward to meeting many of you and discussing your ideas and your projects. So while I'm here, please consider me a colleague. My office is across the hall, and I'm available. Office hours are all the time, so please come by and talk to me. Of course, I want to thank Flaminio especially for arranging the visit and for so much more beyond the visit. I mean, his own important research, his leadership in the European social science and agent-based model communities, ESSA, one of the founding editors of the flagship journal of all this, the Journal of Artificial Societies, Social Simulation, and most recently, his encouragement that I guest edit a special section of the journal on inverse generative social science that I'll discuss in the next lecture, which is on Monday, I believe at 4:30.
Yeah.
So I've been very lucky to have Flaminio as a colleague and supporter and great friend for many years. So thank you yet again, Flaminio. Just as background, a little bit, as Flaminio outlined, over the years, my main lines of activity have really been these. I mean, first, I really agree that it's very important to get the epistemology of this right. Philosophy of it is quite central. And I've tried to articulate a generative explanatory standard for the social sciences, which I'll talk about. I've also been centrally implicated in the development of the agent-based model, which I consider to be the principal scientific instrument of generative social science. In the book, Flaminio mentions generative social science. There are many applications to epidemiology, economics, conflict, game theory, archaeology, all sorts of applications now of the technique. But a central effort of late has been to develop a formal alternative to the rational actor, which dominates mathematical social science and economics and game theory. And, Agent Zero is meant to be an alternative to that and a rigorous formal one, and a foundation for generative social science. And then I also, in the course of my lectures, I want to talk about this idea, inverse generative social science, which is a special section of the journal, the March issue, that uses AI to evolve families of generative agents. And I'll talk about that. And it's possible, you can imagine beginning with Agent Zero, but beginning in other ways as well. So I'll talk about all of that. All right, so the lectures here in May are today's lecture, Generative Social Science and Agent Zero. The lecture Monday, Inverse Generative Social Science, Backward to the Future, a subtitle will become clear. And a talk on epidemiology, toward cognitive epidemiology. And this is meant to be a double entendre because I think things like fear and other cognitive states are themselves transmissible. But I also want to introduce behavior and cognition into epidemiology, which I'll talk about as another major effort in wearing my epidemiology hat at NYU. Okay, so two-part talk today. I want to discuss generative social science and this idea of a generative explanation, present the Agent Zero, and just to say, Agent Zero, like all theoretical models, Agent Zero is an idealization. But the question is it a better idealization? Is it a better ideal guess than the rational actor? Okay, so to begin, Einstein said, science without epistemology is primitive and muddled, insofar as it is thinkable at all. So let's talk a little bit about this. And just at a very high level, I'd like to make a couple important distinctions. The first is between explaining things and predicting them. And the second is between emulating things and explaining them. And I think these arise all over the place. So let's just slowly talk about that. Explanation. I mean, I'm talking about generative explanation, and I distinguish between explaining things, that is, identifying why they happen, by what mechanism do they happen, versus predicting, which is a statement that they'll happen or when they'll happen. So why are there earthquakes and tsunamis? Plate tectonics explains why those occur, but we can't predict the next earthquake or tsunami. Why are there new viruses like SARS-CoV-2? Evolution explains, but we can't predict the next strain. We can't even predict next year's flu strain. Why is there lightning? Well, electrostatics explains, but we can't predict the next lightning bolt. So point one, you can explain, that is, identify a generative mechanism, a mechanism, without being able to predict. So explain does not imply predict. And conversely, predict does not imply explain. Let's talk about this a little bit. So for example, here's a very famous time series from the Hudson Bay Company, a trapping company in Canada. And they were capturing, lynx, Canadian lynx, a kind of snow cat. And this is the history of snow cat pelts that they harvested. And it's correlated with population. So this is a picture of the lynx population or harvest at every year. Can we predict next year from prior years? Here it is. Can I predict? Can I start somewhere and tell you what the next one will be? And yeah, an autoregressive moving average model does very, very well. So here's a famous result from Priestley that says the pelts on Monday are constant times the pelts on Sunday, plus the pelts on Saturday, plus the pelts on Friday, plus noise. And if you fit this, you get very nice coefficients. And the equation does a very nice job predicting the lynx cycles. It tells you, given I'm at lynx on day t, what will be the lynx on day t plus 1. So it predicts. Does it explain? Does it give you a mechanism for the cycles, the lynx cycles? Anybody notice anything missing? Is there something missing from this picture? Yeah, the prey are missing. The lynx are eating these snow cats. And the real story, of course, is that it's a predator-prey cycle. So the lynx alone are just really one part of a predator-prey cycle. So, but I can predict it. But without the prey, I have no real understanding of why there is cycling, why are there oscillations, and this is a predator-prey system. Okay, so again, it's predict, but I didn't explain. So predict and explain are logically independent. You might be able to do both, but neither implies the other. Okay, so let's agree on that. And I think when we talk about generative social science and LLMs and AI, this is a crucial distinction because, of course, AI, LLMs, these can predict, but they don't give us any insight into the human being. So I want to do that, okay? Third point is that emulation does not imply explanation. And again, I think this is particularly relevant to AI and large language models, which we'll return to, but briefly, AI, these systems are displacing humans, they're augmenting humans, they're defeating humans, but they're not explaining humans. And we'll come back to this. And I think the explanatory standard is crucial. And again, this is, I think, widely confused. All right. But to make this point about AI, I think this is a rampant confusion, right? That the thing puts out, output that looks like a human, so it's getting some insight into how humans work. And I think the original sin here is actually Turing's and the Turing test. And I want to explain why I think this is completely irrelevant to generative explanation. So let's play a version of Turing's imitation game that I imagine you've all encountered. I'm the subject, and behind the screen is a soprano and a perfect recording of that soprano. And let's assume no human could tell them apart. The recording emulates the human, but tells me nothing about how humans vocalize. By what mechanism do humans generate sounds at all? Right? We blow wind across our vocal cords and that they vibrate and produce a disturbance in the medium, and that waveform smashes into Flaminio's eardrum and he experiences sound. But the fact that the recording and the soprano are indistinguishable doesn't tell me anything about how sopranos work. So emulation of the output does not illuminate the generative mechanism, and we're interested in it. So when the LLM completes a sentence, it doesn't tell us anything about how humans acquire grammar, things like this. And we're interested in these underlying explanatory things. So we're interested in something different than predicting and something different from emulating. What is it I'm interested in? Sorry, let's look backwards. This way. Interested in this idea, all right? Generative explanation, not the same as prediction, not the same as emulation, and many other issues. But here's the idea: to explain a social pattern, like a segregation pattern or a wealth distribution or a pattern of violence or an epidemic dynamic, you have to show how the pattern, the social macroscopic pattern, could emerge on timescales of interest in a population of cognitively plausible agents. And we'll come back to that phrase, which is of course central. Grow it from the bottom up in a population of cognitively plausible agents. That's what I mean by explaining the macroscopic phenomenon. And the motto, if you like, is if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain. Now, this is a very mischievous thing. It's a necessary condition. That is, if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain. That doesn't mean that any old way of growing it is explanatory. I mean, I could have some migration pattern. People arrive in the pattern utterly at random, but I don't think that's how people decide to migrate. So the converse is not true. If you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. And there might be lots of ways of explaining it. There might be many generative mechanisms. And the whole point of inverse generative social science is to evolve many alternative generators, families of generators. It's also not the picture of Nash equilibrium in game theory, which you may have encountered, not optimal control theory, a la Gary Becker and others. It's not the same as a Markov process, which says I move from state to state with some probability, but doesn't tell me why, it just tells me the probability, and so forth. Not regression. Regression is aggregate to aggregate. It tells me how an aggregate change on the right-hand side produces an aggregate change on the left-hand side. But it doesn't tell me the underlying generative mechanism. All of these are important, powerful, interesting, deep, but they're not the same as this idea, all right? Now, we can and really must argue about this phrase, cognitive plausibility. But I think few people would really dispute that human behavior is affected by emotions, by deliberations, however bounded they may be, and by interactions with other agents. I think if you're designing a kind of space of cognitively plausible agents, those are reasonably good axes, okay? I want emotions, I want deliberations, I want social interaction. I might have all sorts of other things, but I'm saying as a minimal first step in the direction of a formal alternative, a generative explanatory alternative to the rational actor, those are good dimensions to have in the creature. And again, as Flaminio mentioned, this is a long-standing theme in philosophy, in history, in psychology, literature. Hume said, reason is a slave to the passions. And Aristotle that man is by nature a social animal. So I was looking for some simple convolution of passion, reason, and social interaction. An agent that incorporates that, and my tentative proposal is agent 0, excuse me, which was published in 2014 by Princeton, 13, agent 0 toward neurocognitive foundations for generative social science. All right, so we agree that cognitively plausible agents have emotions, and I was particularly interested in fear because we understand that a little bit. They have bounded deliberative capacity. This is really in the Herb-Simon tradition. And they have social connection with other agents who are driven by emotions and have bounded deliberative capacity. They're crummy at statistics, they have rotten data, those sorts of things, all right? And all of those might matter. So agent zero has distinct affective, deliberative, and social modules, each of which is grounded in contemporary neuroscience. And these internal emotional, deliberative, and social dimensions interact to produce agent zero's observable behavior. And when you put a bunch of these agents together and let them interact, it generates a very wide variety of collective dynamics in fields of health, conflict, networks. I'm going to talk about why networks happen and how they change, economics, social psychology, law. And, you know, although there's quite a lot of empirical work now since the book, Agent Zero proper and the book is really a kind of unapologetically theoretical exercise. The idea was, let's get the synthesis started. We can argue about exactly how to represent fear, exactly how to represent human statistical activity. But let's get the synthesis started. We can get the modules finished, but wire something together provisionally and see if it generates something illuminating. And that was the spirit. Now, crucially though, it's a formal model. There's a lot of empirical criticism of the rational actor in economics, in game theory, lots of experimental results, some would argue, falsifying experimental results if you read Kahneman and others. But, you know, even decisive experiments don't really change scientific practice. I mean, I think most rational choice people who say, yeah, we know it's not really the human, but we don't have a formal alternative and it's analytically tractable and beautiful and so forth. So we need explicit formal alternatives if we're really going to make a difference. I think Samuelson said, you can only beat a model with another model. So here's another model, formal model. All right, and before giving you the equations and getting under the hood and getting technical about it, I'd just like to give you a broad overview of how the thing works in the context of violence, in a violence interpretation. We're also going to talk about interpretation in capital flight, all sorts of other epidemic dynamics, things like this. But I think the clearest version is perhaps the violence interpretation. So things transpire on a landscape. You can imagine here are three agent zeros. I think I can point to them maybe. 1, 2, 3 agent zeros. Imagine them as foreign soldiers, invaders in this land, this landscape of indigenous patches, each of which is colored a little different shade of yellow. These are not agent zero agents. They're just sites that become active with some probability. And we imagine that these three agent zeros are occupying this land, this world, and that some sites are inactive, the yellow sites, and some sites are active. They attack the invaders, they resist the occupiers, they ambush these agent zeros. And when they do, their site turns orange. So it's peaceful over here, and it's gone over here with the indigenous population attacking these invaders, all right? The invaders have a binary action they can take. They can destroy sites within some destructive radius. Those sites turn black or dark blood red, if you like, when they retaliate. And the stimulus landscape itself, the ambushscape, produces a disposition to take that action, disposition to retaliate, all right? So what's the passion component? Agents' fear condition on local aversive stimuli, the orange sites. They're not deliberating, they're not choosing, they're not calculating, they're just becoming afraid by a process of associative conditioning that we'll explain and model mathematically. All right, so this is not a choice, it's not a decision, it's just fear. At the same time, they are making a calculation, a boundedly rational calculation, where they look around their vision, which is just their von Neumann neighborhood, north, south, east, and west of them, and they calculate the relative frequency of attackers over all sites within their vision. So it's orange over orange plus yellow within my vision. And they take a moving average of that over some memory window, which is limited. All right, so they're local samplers, relative frequentists, limited memory, they're very simple. And if they were operating completely alone, the sum of those is their solo disposition, their propensity to perform the retaliatory act if they're absolutely alone. But they're not alone, they're social animals. And so we add others' solo dispositions to their total disposition. The weights, it turns out, are endogenous links. What did I do?
Sharing it again? Yeah, stop sharing it again.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it ended the sharing by itself because you see this card, it's like it's not sharing.
Maybe maybe the pointer did that, or I hit something.
Yeah, here.
Maybe I did that. They're killing the problem.
I don't know what is. Was that fear? What?
Clear so far?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. If it's not, just ask, okay? If it's clear and stupid, tell me at the end. If it's unclear, ask.
Oh, it's really that bad. It's the presentation. Seems that when we
I'm giving up on the pointer and the clicker.
how's this one?
All right, just full screen now.
Yeah, but when I turn the full screen, it go black.
Maybe it's.
That's not. Where's my number?
I just came along and sort of check. You.
It's weird. Try to first share, or try to share first. Share the screen first and then. That's what you need.
Share first and then next.
Now it's not shared.
The best way, the other way is to share screen and keep this without in the wall. So just keep
We'll
it.
just get the.
Is it shared?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
But it is.
Sorry, I couldn't do that. So crazy. Right. Now?
Yeah. Use this one.
Okay, good.
Okay, so.
Nice. Can I get this? Is that
This, so that.
okay? And this is in my way, but nobody else's. Just right.
No, so.
Oh, all right. Okay. Nice. Okay, good. So you just struggle with this, okay? All right. Hey, why don't you go? All right. All right, well, here we were explaining the situation. Okay? And if full screen this doesn't work, no, fine.
This is.
It kills it again.
Because
Irrelevant.
that's.
Hi, okay, all right, so here we are. And the agents are moving around, the 3 agent 0 agents are moving around this landscape. Some sites are attacking them, which is an aversive, fear-inducing stimulus. And they're becoming afraid of yellow sites, all right? And they have this combination of a fear response, a bounded rational, limited statistical estimate of the threat, and they're connected to other agents by weights, which are indicated by these links, okay? So that's the picture. And what happens is they're moving around. And what's interesting for us is we're going to fix one of these agents in the peaceful south, this agent here. Never attacked, never had a bad experience with any yellow agents, but by a process of dispositional contagion, he wipes out his village, all right? And again, the vision is just local, von Neumann. So he's never been threatened by anybody, but he nonetheless wipes out his village. How does that happen? These ones, they're all linked. These ones are up in the threatening part of the world, and they're fear conditioning, and they're calculating the frequency of attacks, and they're forming a disposition to retaliate. And the disposition amplifies between the two of them, and they're over their thresholds, and they attack their sites. But even though he's not ever been attacked, the contagion of that retaliatory disposition induces him to destroy his village, all right? So think of the Milan massacre, if any of you are old enough to know about that. Let's see if this runs. Okay. There we go. So they're moving around in the north, they're being attacked, and eventually this contagion of fear and estimate trips him. They each have a threshold beyond which, a threshold that triggers the retaliation. I didn't mention that, all right? And all the thresholds are the same. It would be cheating to give people different thresholds. All right? Okay, good. So is that clear? You want to see that again for fun? No, I'll show it again later. All right, so that's the idea, okay? And to understand why that happens, we do need to look under the at the overall setup. All right, so the overall setup is, and again, although we're looking at the violence interpretation, it could be, refuse vaccine, it could be dump stock, whatever it is, we're thinking of behavior as a binary action, a 0 or a 1, all right? And every agent has a non-real threshold, tau, greater than or equal to 0. And again, I'm setting these all equal for now, because I think in a large population, you might draw them from a distribution and do all sorts of sensible things, but for the moment, we're just going to give them the same threshold. And again, okay. All right, good. All right. So they have these affective and deliberative modules. These are both real valued functions, and I'll show you in a minute, bounded to the unit interval defined on this stochastic stimulus space. We'll come back to exactly what those are. But the solo disposition, I thought, look, just to get things started, make it as simple as possible. And we'll start by saying your disposition is the sum of your fear level and your probability of attack calculation. All right, it's passion plus reason, okay, just the simplest possible step. So your solo disposition operating alone is passion plus reason, and if it's over the threshold, you retaliate within your destructive radius. But of course, agents don't operate in solo, they're connected to other agents, and we imagine a network with weights W, the weight of the jth agent on the ith agent changes with time, and we'll show you that. It's not a fixed network, times the solo. So what you really register is your total disposition, which is what you do alone, plus the weighted sum of what others in your network would do. And if that exceeds some threshold, then you retaliate, okay? So let's unpack this a little bit. So if your total disposition exceeds your threshold, you retaliate. What is your total disposition? It's your solo disposition plus the sum of weighted dispositions of others. Now, what is this in detail? It's passion plus reason, your affective and deliberative modules. And now the fear module is the Rescorla-Wagner model of fear conditioning, which is a very famous model of fear acquisition and extinction, and it's a differential equation. This should be F dot. The derivative of F with respect to time is a constant times maximum possible fear minus fear today. So in difference terms, it would be the change from Tuesday to Monday would be a constant, the learning rate, times the maximum, which is taken to be 1, minus the fear the day before. All right, but differential equation is simple first order, non-homogeneous linear differential equation, which can be solved explicitly. The probability is simply, as I say, the moving average of relative frequencies of attacks within your vision. So you're looking around, you can see, your von Neumann neighborhood, and you're calculating attacks over total sites. That's the relative frequency, and you're carrying the moving average of that over some memory window, which the user can choose. All right, the weights, again, are not constants. They're a kind of strength scale affective homopoly. Your weight, the weight between two agents, is a function of how similar they are in their field. If you feel like the other guy, you feel close to the other. All right, we'll come back to this and unpack this generally, but it's a strength scale. If F is fear, strength scale affective homopoly. This is how close you are to one another, and this is the strength of your two affective, emotional, modules. So all in all, I think there are probably maybe 5 parameters, arguably 4, since this is always taken to be 1. Maximum associative strength is 1. And the fact that the weights are endogenous eliminates 2n parameters, right? If it weren't endogenous, then I'd need a weight between every 2 agents, and I might make it a bidirectional one, and you've got massive parameter explosion. Here, there's no parameter explosion because everything is endogenous. So I think of it as, I think von Neumann said with 5 parameters I can model anything, but I think I'm maybe not over that threshold. It's meant to be a simple, parsimonious, transparent, provisional, revealing model, okay? So this is the picture, and the action rule, again, right, yeah, is that, you act if your total disposition is greater than your threshold, or if you think of net threshold as total minus, net disposition is your total minus your threshold, then the action rule is really simple. It's just retaliate if net disposition is positive. All right, so the idea is clean, simple model. Does it do anything of interest? All right, now notice that this is a model of dispositional contagion. It's not a model of imitating behavior. Nobody else's observable action appears in that system of equilibrium. So the mechanism of action can't be the imitation of behavior, because the binary acts, the retaliatory acts of others, are not registered in the calculation. So again, it's an idealization, but for the moment I'm suspending the normal kind of monkey see, monkey do imitation picture of social transmission. It's more of a cognitive transmission, and we'll return to that when we talk about cognitive epidemiology. The obvious problem with imitation of behavior, of observable action, is there's no mechanism for the first actor. And the first actor has nobody to imitate. So how things get started is unaccounted for in the imitative picture. But I have a mechanism, and I don't think noise is a real mechanism. I could always say toss a coin if it's heads, you start. That's not really a good cognitively plausible mechanism, and I think we have one. We'll come back to this. Of course, the landscape itself requires further apparatus, right? It has to have parameters about activation rates, initial conditions for everything, and that's all true. But the agent alone, the agent object alone, is meant to be very simple and transparent, and maybe you agree with this. Okay. Excuse me. So the subtitle of Agent Zero is Toward Neurocognitive Foundations for Generative Social Science. We talked about generative social science, and of course, again, we're talking about fear here, all right? So what's the neurocognitive angle in all of this? How do I justify? Does the neuroscience license this representation of the human? And we're going to talk about fear acquisition and fear extinction. And here's just a tiny bit of neuroscience. I don't claim to have the slightest expertise in this area, but have benefited from the wise counsel of real neuroscientists at NYU and elsewhere. But the idea is, you know, you're marching along and a lion blasts out of the high grass and roars at you. There's a response in your auditory system. It triggers your amygdala and the amygdaloid system, which again is a subject in its own right. And the amygdala releases hormones, endocrines, all sorts of signals that cause you to freeze when the lion jumps at you. It raises your blood pressure, your hair stands on end, there are electrodermal responses, a million things go on, adrenaline is released, and that's all done by the amygdala. There's more, you know, huge literature. Joe Ledoux has been my main guiding light in all this. He's at NYU. Oops, okay, and we know something about this whole area. It's been mapped out pretty well. But I will say that I don't care where things are happening in the brain. I'm not modeling the tissue science of the brain. I'm just interested that it's an innate response, it's automatic, it's fast, and it's inaccessible to deliberation. If I throw a snake in your lap, you freeze. You don't think about, oh, is that a real snake or a joke rubber snake? Oh, you know, you just freeze. And then later, and that's by this, what Joe calls the low road, the quick and dirty low road that I looked at. All right, there's a stimulus and your amygdala responds and you freeze. Your hair stands on end, your pupils dilate. I'm going to decide to do, I think I'll decide why my pupils. I'll decide for my hair to stand up. You know, I'll decide it's time to sweat. You know, that just doesn't happen. It's automatic and it's not a choice. Rational Choice. This is not a choice at all, right? But it happens. And, you know, we're equipped with this machinery. Okay, and Donald Hebb famously said, neurons that fire together wire together. So if I start to accumulate stimulus and I begin to associate the stimulus with the threat. So here, let's see, that's not too clear, but let's go up to it. All right, so here's a standard fear conditioning exercise, all right? This is a picture of a subject in an fMRI, and this is her amygdala. Orange indicates blood recruitment to the amygdala, which is a crude indicator of amygdala entrainment, activation, and that it's sending these signals, all right? And the experiment is, if I show you a blue light, nothing happens. It's completely neutral. It doesn't enlist your amygdala or produce any fear, anything. It's a blue light. But if I put a shock cuff on you that's aversive and surprising, then if I show you the shock, if I give you the shock, then your amygdala does land. It's like, what the heck was that? And now if I start pairing the blue light and the shock, blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock, and I show you the blue light alone, this is what happens. You come to associate the blue light with the shock, and the blue light alone elicits the amygdala response, all right? And there's a very simple model of this, published in '72. Large literature surrounds it. But again, we're trying to be simple. And this is a Riscola-Wagner model that says the gain in associative strength between the blue light and the shock grows depending on the salience and surprise of the stimulus times maximum associative strength minus previous associative strength. Because if you're at the maximum, you can't learn anymore. And you learn fastest when you're farthest from the maximum. So your curve is increasing with diminishing marginal gain. All right, and again, I showed you the differential equation version of this. This is the difference equation version of it that, of course, I programmed in NetLogo. All the code is available, by the way, for all the runs I'll show you. They should be on my ABM Lab NYU site. All right, so this is the picture. Learning is fast when the stimulus is shocking, but we become inured to the stimulus and learning slows. So that's going to be the agent's passion module. And again, they're not choosing anything, all right? There's not a choice to be afraid. What you do when you're afraid is another matter. All right? Now, that's how fear is acquired. Does it spread? I'm modeling fear as a contagious phenomenon. Can I justify that? Does the neuroscience license that assumption? Well, two answers. Interesting, different answers. We looked at this experiment with, here's the subject, blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light on, amygdala. Now, the really interesting experiment conducted by Liz Phelps, also at NYU, was of someone observing those conditioning trials. There's a person observing Flaminio get trained, blue light shock, blue light shock, blue light shock. Then I show the blue light at the observer, and their amygdala lights up. So I don't have to experience the primary stimulus to undergo the conditioning. Okay? I learned to fear the fire by watching you get burned in the fire. Obviously a good thing, evolutionarily, right? Another answer is a different, more recent experiment on, this is when you're not watching someone else get burned, you're actually seeing frightened faces. And it also activates your amygdala. Of course, there's a huge amount of anecdotal, and not anecdotal, but historical literature on fear contagion. Adam Smith thought it was a real thing. His writing on this is very, very colorful. He knew himself, and millions of psychologists since. But from a neuroscience standpoint, this strikes me as sort of, good experimental evidence of this type of thing. So this one is shown faces of scared people, and it recruits his amygdala. The paper is called Empathy and Facial Mimicry of Fear and Disgust during observation of dynamic facial expressions. Disgust is also interesting, but not a topic today. All right, so this is the picture. Is fear contagious? We're going to say, yeah, it is contagious. And obviously, that's a great thing. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's very useful that I can learn to fear the stove by watching you get burned. I don't have to get burned to know that I should stay away from it. And in turn, I could flee because I see that you are scared. I mean, if I throw a snake in the middle of the room, a lot of people will flee, but none of them will see the snake. They'll see that Flamingo is scared, and they'll be scared too. All right, so these are very simple ideas, really, that I think ring true and also have some support in the neuroscience. Now, advantageous as that is, it's double-edged, right? The same architecture supports the rapid, non-conscious acquisition and transmission of baseless fears and biases, right? And so we have many examples of this. We had blue light shock, fear of the light, but Vietnamese face ambushes during the Vietnam War, and you get this horrific massacre of an innocent village. Arab face, the 9/11 attack, massive anti-Muslim discrimination, violence, even murder of innocent Muslims based on this association. People didn't have much, had never seen Muhammad Atta's face before. But if it's 9/11 Muhammad Atta, Muslim terror. All right, that's not good. Japanese face, Pearl Harbor, massive internment of Japanese Americans. 60% were American citizens. Terrible Tuskegee experiments, enduring distrust of the medical establishment. MMR vaccine, autism, vaccine refusal. Again, if you're in a speculative bubble and your expectations are great returns, and then the bubble bursts, there's a fear spike and a contagion of sell-offs. And I'm working on this empirically with some colleagues at Oxford. All right, so it's double-edged. Furthermore, it can persist long beyond any sort of, long before there's any basis. But this is also an evolved element. You know, you're supposed to stay afraid of hippos. If a hippo jump, it's stupid to, you know, it would be crazy to learn to fear hippos on Monday and then forget to fear them again on Tuesday, right? You're supposed to maintain the fear. And it can remain above the threshold long after the stimulus has stopped, as we'll see. And even after we know that it's stopped, our deliberative module can say, look, there's just no threat of hippos anymore, but I'm still afraid of hippos, right? And that turns out to be important too. And how is the fear can extinguish? In the learning phase, we had maximum strength of 1. For extinction, mathematically, we just set that to 0. And when the stimulus stops, this was 1. When we set it to 0, you just get exponential decay of the fear, all right? Another very simple little differential equation, okay? All right, so the full affective trajectory with acquisition and extinction looks like this. You get acquisition at first. When the stimulus stops, the fear decays, but not immediately. And this is replicated in a million experiments with vertebrates of all kinds. This is with a trial with rats. The conditioning phase is this. Stimulus stops, the extinction phase looks like this with a predatory threat. And if you like mathematics, you can express the entire trajectory in Heaviside unit step functions in this way, all right? And the way I put it is, you know, we don't fear what the rat fears, but we fear how the rat fears. And Joe Ledoux calls all of these, this whole apparatus, survival circuitry that's preserved across vertebrate evolution, including humans and so forth, all right? And there's a nice article by Trim and Company on why natural selection might favor that rule in the Journal of Theoretical Biology. Again, you know, I'm going with this. I'm completely open to swapping out this module for other emotional modules. I think we should do that. And I think inverse generative social science will produce other ones. But again, can we get this thing wired together and does it do anything illuminating? All right. All right, so that's the passion piece, all right? Passion plus reason plus social. This is the passion piece we just reviewed, fear acquisition. But there's also a deliberative component. And, you know, Hume said reason is a slave to the passions, but it does happen now and then, reason, however poorly. And, you know, typically we have incomplete and imperfect information, like our agent zeros. We make systematically eroding appraisals of the information we have. We're not good statisticians. We make all sorts of rudimentary mistakes. And all of this is very well documented in the literature on psychology, cognitive science, decision theory, and so forth. Lots of robustly documented departures from perfect rationality. Here are some of my favorites, framing sense. If someone comes in to the doctor considering surgery, and the doctor says the surgery is 90% successful, they'll be inclined to take the surgery. But if I tell them 1 in 10 patients die, they'll turn it down when the numbers are exactly the same, right? So how things are presented matters. Kahneman and Tversky prospect theory shows that there's asymmetric weights on losses and gains, right? There's loss aversion. The representative heuristic is that people mistake the local sample for the population. I think our agents are doing that. People neglect base rates when they update. So the probability that a test is positive given that you're sick is mistaken for the probability that you're sick given that the test is positive. And it turns out, unfortunately, the doctors make this mistake all the time. And there's anchoring, which is one of my very favorites, which is kind of a framing effect. So if I took half the group and I read you the numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, tell me the product. Don't think, just blurt a number. You'll blurt some number. And I take the other half of the group and I say, I read 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, blurt out a number. This group will blurt out a higher number than this one because you anchored on the 8 rather than the 2. So there are all these anomalous behaviors that a perfectly rational creature wouldn't do but the humans are well known. And I'm trying to put some of these into agent zero. He's a local relative frequentist. He's a representative heuristic person, you know, and so forth. All right. So, and again, the way I try to capture that is that they make an estimate that the probability of a randomly selected yellow site will turn orange is the moving average of local relative frequencies of orange agents over some memory window. Very primitive idea. They're not Bayesian updaters. They're just simple local relative frequentists, okay? And of course, since it's a memory, if the stimulus stops, the memory will eventually be clear. Entries, positive entries will be overwritten by zeros, and over time, you'll lose the probability. You will say, well, the probability is zero. And the code's quite flexible. I gave the user lots of options. You can choose a moving median instead of a moving average. And of course, you know, it's simple to alter this as well, right? So it's a starting point, but I think a defensible one. And the social component, again, agents driven by strong and unconscious emotions like fear, doing crude statistics on rotten data, also influence each other. And there are conformist pressures that then produce widespread adoption and counterproductive behaviors. And conformity effects, of course, have a very long history in the literature of psychology. But again, you know, what do we know from more or less contemporary neuroscience? There's a great paper by Ethan Cross, concluding that when rejection is powerfully elicited, areas that support the sensory components of physical pain become active. And their experiment looks like this. The subject, again, in an fMRI, is shown pictures of the wife who abandoned them, the kids who kicked them off the team, the romantic other who ditches them, and so forth. And the areas that are recruited when images of those rejections are shown are the same ones that are painful. And what they write is, these results give new meaning to the idea that rejection hurts. Rejection and physical pain are similar, not only that they're distressing, they share a common somatosensory representation as well. So, you know, we give others weight. All right, and third, so that's the next component. And the final component is this social, I mean, it supports the idea that conformity is real, okay? Because it hurts not to be rejected, and you conform to avoid that. All right? And the way I model that is with these affective dynamics for the weights. And it raises this question. I mean, I think a lot of network science, much of it very good, assumes a fixed network structure. Networks don't change. And they don't even account of why networks happen. Why networks even happen? I mean, there's a lot of literature on this. Mediums contributed to this importantly, and so forth. We'll return to these topics on weights and how they happen, how they change endogenously. But for the moment, let's go ahead and this is the picture. There's some stimulus. It produces a disposition to retaliate. If the disposition exceeds threshold, you do retaliate. That, of course, feeds back to change the stimulus pattern. You've destroyed sites. You're giving versus stimulus. So there's feedback between the micro world and the macro world, and these co-evolve. Let's see if it gets at anything interesting, okay? Again, questions, is this pretty clear? All right. We looked at this picture before. Agents are moving around this landscape on the left. In the northeast, there's all this rebellious activity or attacks and ambushes. That stimulates these agents to go above their threshold. And even though this agent isn't attacked, it exceeds his threshold and he wipes out his innocent damage. All right, let's just for fun, we'll see this again. Now that you know what's going on. Okay, here's all this activity. These guys are triggered. They triggered this. All right, simple picture. All right, now why does that happen? This is a pun on the human condition. I gave this talk in Paris. So the condition humaine. It's conditioning, but it's also the human condition. Why does that happen? Why does this guy go? It's because his total disposition exceeds his threshold. Even though his threshold exceeds his solo disposition, he wouldn't go alone. He goes in the group. All right? You take action that you wouldn't take alone. And in fact, if we go back to this net disposition idea, you're negatively disposed to take the action on your own. So you take it in the group. All right? Now, the destruction reduces the aversive attack rate. So, as I discussed in an earlier paper, you could interpret agent zero as a disposition minimizer. He doesn't like having net disposition, net retaliatory disposition, or excess disposition, to be economistic, and he takes action to reduce it. He destroys sites. He destroys indigenous sites within his radius. And that action does reduce the rate of attacks, and with it, his destructive disposition. But because fear can decay far more slowly, the killing can continue long after any basis for it has vanished. And that's illustrated here. Right? These agents continue killing outside the threatening zone. He's killing outside the zone, he's killing outside the zone. They know that there's no evidence anymore. But their affect is decaying too slowly to make them stop. All right? So they're killing without attack because the evidence, because the emotion decays much more slowly than the evidence. All right, and this is consistent with a very famous experiment by the Zillman company that's been replicated a lot. It's an old experiment, but the title is The Irrelevance of Mitigating Circumstances in Retaliatory Behavior at High Levels of Excitation. And they write, under circumstances of moderate arousal, mitigating circumstances are found to reduce retaliation. In contrast, these mitigating circumstances failed to exert any appreciable effort on retaliation under conditions of extreme arousal. The cognitively mediated inhibition of retaliatory behavior is impaired at high levels of sympathetic arousal and anger. Now, this produces a straightforward violation of rational choice theory, and I want to explain exactly how. Again, now, anybody who's taken a little microeconomics will know about this. But the idea is, I imagine some level of activity, in this case, destructive activity, but it could be any activity, some level X of activity, like the number of cars I produce, number of potatoes I buy, number of hours I spend jogging, number of acres I bring under cultivation. Every level of that activity confers some benefit, B of X, and also incurs some cost, C of X. In the production context, P would be revenue. It's the unit price times the quantity I sell. And C is the wage per workers times the number of workers employed. All right? And the profit level at that level of production X is B of X, profit X is benefit minus cost. Now, I want to maximize profit. And at an optimum, again, if you little calculus first, I take the derivative of this and set it equal to 0. And that means the derivative of B is equal to the derivative of C. And so marginal benefit equals marginal cost at an optimum. I mean, if there were a microeconomics t-shirt, that would be written on it, okay? And again, to put it a little more simply, if I have some activity, every time I do it, I get a benefit, but I get a cost. And after a while, the benefit is diminishing and the cost is growing. And the minute I get to the point where if I produce one more, the cost will exceed the benefit, that's where I stop. And that's where the marginal benefit from the next unit of activity is outweighed by the cost of that activity. All right? This is the idea. Marginal benefit equals marginal cost for a rational actor. Now, the agent's destruction, now back to our landscape, the agent's continuing destruction outside the threatening zone doesn't reduce the aversive attack rate at all. They're killing innocents. They're not killing attackers. And therefore, the marginal benefit of those attacks is 0. So if the incremental cost in retaliation, ammunition expended, time spent, whatever it is, in whatever resources we're working, if the incremental cost is any number, then the behavior is economically irrational, in that the marginal cost of continuing retaliation exceeds the marginal benefit, which is zero. Now, the rational choice theorist might say, well, okay, but the agent perceives positive benefit. And here, importantly, no, he doesn't. And this is just the point. His conscious module knows the benefit to be zero. It is returning an ambush probability of zero, as shown in that plot. But the fear decays much more slowly, as shown in the lower plot. The killing persists after any empirical support for it has evaporated. The agents don't seek economic equilibrium, but a kind of cognitive, emotional equilibrium. And here I would sort of raise Hume by one and say, yeah, reason is a slave to the passions and knows itself to be. Again, let's look back at this. All right? So again, they have this retaliatory behavior. It continues outside the attacking zone. They're continuing to expend resources, time, effort, whatever it is, outside this zone. So marginal cost of the next attack is positive, but the benefit is zero because these are innocent. And they know it to be zero because their moving average has converged to zero. If you queried them, they'd say, right, I have no data, but I'm killing them because I'm still afraid. So the affective dynamics and the statistical ones can be out of phase, producing behavior that's far from rational. Now, more interesting still, perhaps, is that the killing by this southern agent who's never attacked can occur before any observable provocation at all. He has in the southwest here, there's no attacks. And he goes first. He doesn't just join. He doesn't just join the lynch mob, he leads the lynch mob. Even though he's had no bad experience with anyone. He goes first. How does that happen? Here again. He goes first, right? Now, this is really pretty weird, right? He's had no aversive experience with Black people, and he leads the lynch mob. How does that happen? Again, if you were worrying about imitation, there's nobody to imitate either, because nobody's done it. But in any event, it has our conditioning. They're developing fear, they're making a statistical estimate, they're forming a disposition to retaliate. Neither of their dispositions alone triggers them to respond, but the weighted sum of their dispositions does trigger this guy to respond, and he goes first. Again, I don't think that's really within the ambit of rational choice theory. But I think it's, I think it rings true in some settings for humans. He goes first without sentence. All right? Why? Because they're the only agent with this ordering, the ith agent. Total exceeds threshold, when alone it would not. And everybody else, they don't have this ordering. The threshold exceeds their total, because they don't go. This one is the total exceeding the threshold. So again, these are things that I don't think are easily generated from the standard picture. Now, he goes first. Is he a leader? Does that make him a leader? I mean, is he a man of conviction who goes first, bold leader? Or is he just the most susceptible to dispositional contagion? And I think Tolstoy, who I quoted some length in the Agent Zero book, would answer the latter. He writes, "A king is history's slave, performing for the swarm life." All right? And this whole behavior can scale. If we get the silly thing to block rate, where lots of people go at it, even though the people influencing them, there's actual attacks in this part of the world. These guys' disposition is growing, but it's never over their threshold. But by all this contagion, everybody in the South is over the threshold, and you get a massive result. And just for fun. Condition this thing from resisting. Okay, so here's a picture of that. A little movie of that. All right, these guys are growing, but they're not triggered. But these guys are all triggered. In that sense, they all go first. Okay? All right. Now, that's all about the fight response, the retaliatory response. There's also the flight response. And here, let's do another little game where this is a refugee picture, where this agent would not flee the zone alone, but he's dragged out by others who are over their threshold. This could be conflict refugees. There's some work on this, disaster evacuees, or it could be capital flight from their portfolio, given surprising collapses like Lehman Brothers. Right? So this agent wouldn't leave on her own. But the others convince her that it's time to go. Right? So even though she wouldn't leave alone, the others convince her to come along. Where recalcitrant agents are dragged out. Flaminio, you missed the coolest movie, so I'm going to play it. So we were talking about the agent who goes first. It scales up. Here's a movie of these agents are never attacked. These agents are, but they're never triggered. But the process makes these all retaliate. Okay. You know, you can't miss the cool stuff. You know? All right, and there's, as I say, there's quite a bit of work on this, and it's inspired by Agent Zero. A good replication of Syrian evacuation of Aleppo. As I mentioned, I think financial contagions, capital flight are other very fertile empirical areas of working. Now, implicated in all of this, of course, are networks. And as I said before, network structure is endogenous and dynamic. So we want to know how network weights change and why networks even happen. And the way I approach this, again, try to find some simple model that gets its teeth into this. And again, endogenous weight change by affective homophily struck me as a good starting point. It could be probability homophily, it could be dispositional homophily, and all of those are available in the code. You can toggle between what sort of homophily you're interested in. But I thought, you know, if you've both been in the trenches together and you experience deadly fear, then you're aligned emotionally. Now, the problem, so I started by saying, well, let's just take the difference between their fear levels, I and J. You know, that's how close they are. But that's not great because it's 0 when they're identical. And you'd like it to be strong when they're identical. Okay, thought I. Well, let's do 1 minus that. That looks interesting, although passionless agents with V's of 0 have the same strength as crusaders who have V's of 1. Okay, so let's multiply it by total strength. It's a strength scale, affective homophily, which I think is quite, there's work along these lines by David Lazare on evolution and networks. I'm sure Flaminio knows this literature very well. But that's how I was going to go ahead and do this, and that's how it works. And you can see the weights change depending on my experience. Here, these guys are subject to attacks. The link width is the strength of the connection. You know, and they're in the trenches together, and they're closely aligned. Their strength is growing. All right. Let's see, now their links they're in the trenches together. They've experienced the same fear. They feel close to one another, brothers in arms. Okay. Now, that's a picture of permanent connection with changing connection strength. But normally when we think of networks, we're thinking of links that are on or off. The network is a set of links. So, darn it, network structure is links, they exist or not. We have a continuous weight dynamic, but we want to study structure. So we need to filter the continuous affinity dynamic onto a binary structure of nodes and edges. The simple way to do this again is to just introduce a link threshold, and a link exists when the strength of the connection exceeds the threshold. Otherwise, there's no link. And again, mathematically, this is pretty straightforward. I form a link between I and J if the weight between them is greater than the threshold. And there's no link otherwise. And again, you can play with fancy math, but that's the idea. And of course, there are episodes of connection. When they're above the threshold, they're connected. When they're under the threshold, they're not connected. So these are the weight dynamics. These are the same weight dynamics. But with this threshold, you get episodes of connection. With this threshold, they're always connected. With this threshold, they are sometimes. And with this connection, they are, but less frequently. So if we think of it that way, yeah, you could think of this as, if people study dynamical systems, the network structure is a kind of projection, Poincare, of the continuous affinity dynamic, and the sections are the link thresholds. We can come back to that. But here's the idea. This is the same weight dynamic. But we're only showing links on and off, 0 or 1. I don't know why I included 2 or minus. Just stupid. It's 0 or 1. And with a low threshold, everybody's connected. With a high threshold, very few people are connected, or connections are rare. And in the middle, you get intermittent changes in the network topology itself. So how do networks happen? Well, one plausible mechanism perhaps is affective homophily, which is endogenous because it's generated by the landscape. And how do we get network structure? Why do networks happen? There's some threshold above which there's a link and below which there isn't a link, and you get these changes in network structure itself. So again, it's just a provisional thought about how do we generate networks and see how they change. And again, link formation, it really produces a change in structure proper, but there's no connection, there's partial connection. These two are connected, but the third is not. Everybody's connected, and here their connections are completely dissolved.
So is the assumption that they observe their similarity to each other, that they're aware of the other's the level?
Yeah.
That's the assumption. Mm-hmm. So I know how much fear you feel in that moment.
Yeah, I sense that. As in these fMRI experiments and other episodes experiments where people study contagious, where I show you a frightened face, or there's all this evidence of emotional contagion. So yeah. Okay. Close. And again, this is not the same picture as Barabashi-Albert picture of preferential attachment, which is one of the main mechanisms for network formation in literature. Here, attachment is degree independent, doesn't matter what my degree is. It's a function of strength and homophily. It's degree independent attachment. It's quite a different picture than preferential attachment by degree. All right. And Lazar and Levitan and Wisser talk about this quite a lot. The weakest claim I would make is that it's a testable hypothesis. But on the role of networks generally, here's a toy revolution, the Arab Spring. Okay, this is a complete toy. But the idea is, here are, instead of attacks, they're instances of regime corruption. Abduction without trial, torture, civil liberties, violations. All these things are regime corruption episodes, and they produce a profound grievance. People are really quite angry at the regime, but they can't connect to one another because I've clamped their weights at 0. I've abolished the internet, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. So they can't talk to one another or organize anything, and so you don't get any rebellion. You get tremendous grievance, but no action. But if I let them connect, then their strengths increase and they tip each other over the threshold, they amplify one another. This was inspired by the Tunisian rebellion. So these are supposed to be colored jasmine For those of you who remember. But in any event, with the weights on, you get the overthrow of the regime, which obviously is why people ban freedom of assembly and sorts of other things. But again, that's what weights do. And I really wonder whether the whole, we live in this age of very high connectivity. And I think we're seeing instances of leaderless revolutions. If I asked you, of the Arab Spring, who is the Lenin, the Mao, the Khomeini, the Castro, the Gandhi, the Mandela of the Arab Spring, I don't think you could name them. And I think that's true of many, many cases. It's connectivity that's driving it, not really leadership as such. Another fun toy example, my last, in case you're getting tired, is a jury trial. I recently watched this great movie, 12 Angry Men, where all their opinions are reversed in the course of their colloquy in the jury chamber. And the idea here is we imagine a three-phased trial. There's a landscape of stimulus. Somebody's accused of guilt. Somebody's accused of murder. And there's a great buzz out on the landscape of whether that person is guilty or not. And initial dispositions to convict are formed. The juries are complete strangers. All weights are off. They're just hearing this buzz. Then they're sequestered. Then they're chosen to be on the jury. When they go, now they go to the trial phase, and they hear concerted arguments for and against the individual's guilt. But the weights are still off, they don't communicate. And then they're sequestered in the computer room where these homophily dynamics and network effects operate strongly. And we get another, I'm looking for these dark and interesting results where agents all convict in the group when they would all acquit alone. And again, this is the picture. Here they are, stimulus is greater than zero, weights are zero. They're out here on the landscape hearing all sorts of rumors about the guy did it, the guy didn't do it, she deserved it, whatever it is. They're hearing all this stuff, and they're forming initial impressions of whether the person's guilty or not. Then they're selected to be on the jury. It's a different stimulus pattern with lawyers. The weights are still zero. And then going into the jury chamber, they have these dispositions, and then they communicate all of this to one another. And it turns out in this and in many other ones, they all convict, even though they convict in the jury trial when they would acquit if they were alone. So here, and then this is quite unnecessary. But here's the picture. Here they're out on the street. Here they're in the courtroom. Here they're in the jury chamber. And what you see is that initially, for the first, it's a 90-day trial. Phase one, they have no weight. Each phase is 30 days. The first 30 days, no weights. Second 30 days, no weights. In the jury chamber, everything rockets. And so up to that point, they're below the threshold and would acquit. But together, they unanimously convict. And again, what's the algebra of that? There. It's kind of universal self-betrayal. No jurors would have convicted before the jury phase because everybody has this order. But they're unanimous in rendering a guilty verdict having interacted directly. For every high, the total exceeds the threshold. Okay, so these are, again, results that I think are, really quite interesting and revealing, and are not natural results of a rational choice theory. And so what I wrote is that it's an unsettling picture, and if I may, the overall picture of the human, of Homo sapiens, reflected in these interpretations of Agent Zero is unsettling. Here we have a creature evolved that is selected for high susceptibility to unconscious fear conditioning. Fear, conscious or otherwise, can be acquired rapidly through direct exposure or indirectly through fearful others. This primal emotion is moderated by a more recently evolved deliberative module, which at best operates suboptimally on incomplete data and whose risk appraisals are normally biased further by affect itself. Both affective and cognitive modules, moreover, are powerfully influenced by the dispositions of similar, limited and unconsciously driven agents. Is it any wonder that collectivities of interacting agents of this type, the Agent Zero type, can exhibit mass violence, dysfunctional health behaviors, and financial panic. And again, I leave it to you to answer that. But I think it seems to me that if we really want to understand and avoid these kinds of dynamics, we need alternatives to the rational act. And agent zero is one, and it's an explicit formal. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about using inverse generative social science to evolve other ones. And with that, I thank you for your attention and welcome your comments.
So thank you very much, Josh, for brilliant talk and lecture on. I will just add comments because I would like to keep this kind of 27 minutes for questions and comments from the audience on site and online. Besides the fact that I'm a fan of this social emotion, so the idea that's the most easy normative dispositions and expectations of people are quite efficiently read by reading emotions. So I would be interested specifically to work about this kind of social emotions, correlates or social norms. So it's very good. And the question is that a reflection that I formulated when I was listening to your talk is that must be a confirmation that you're right, in my opinion, is that indeed.
I consider your opinion.
Indeed, I was thinking that at the end of the day, in terms of social evolution, we have built architectures and artifacts. Think about rules, exactly to avoid this kind of emotional, exposing people to emotional stimulus, right?
Yeah.
So we build rules, we build organizations, we build markets, infrastructure, exactly because we know how much everything starts from emotional stimuli. So if you need to go to the zero level about instead of creating sophisticated theoretical scaffolds like the rational utility, you go down, it's probably exactly the point of get to the foundations of our social behaviors, which is exactly the emotional stimuli. That we try to remove sometimes, but we don't. As you say with the financial crisis, we build infrastructure in which people should act rationally, not emotionally, but at the end of the day, emotions come back, right? So that's it. Anyway, so very brilliant work, and I hope that this can inspire all this kind of audience, specifically, particularly the younger generation of social scientists, to follow your line and your inspiration.
Go after it, you know?
So this is, I would like to open this kind of 5 minutes for any question. I will start from the participants in this room, but then saving time also for the online. So if you have any question online, you can either read it in the chat or at some point raise your hand and you will talk. By the way, if you turn on your video, notice that your big face will appear and shock you, probably like a snake example.
Yeah, exactly.
It's shocking the audience here, but anyway, good to see your face in case. So please turn on the video so that we can see you in case you want to pose a question. So we'll start first from the audience here. Any question?
Come on, please, yeah. Be brave.
So I will start myself. So that's so great. Yes. How much is the how much this kind of link between emotions and deliberation points to the importance of emotion exactly because of the fear example. So because of this context, how much this is very much context specific or generalizable across different like, social contexts? What do you think about that?
Very good question. And I don't really know the answer yet, although I think that's the next research agenda, is to see if we can apply models in this family to a huge sphere of activities, from violence to financial panic. I think financial panic is a very good, and I'm working on this, flash panics with a couple of colleagues at Oxford. You know, fear. You get a fear spike because there's surprise and salience. It has to be surprising and salient. The shock has to be a surprise and you have to care about it. And you know, what is surprise? It's the violation of expectations. So when you're in a speculative bubble, a financial, you have very high expectations about returns. And then when some giant company like Lehman Brothers collapses, that's a big surprise, and it's a salient one, and there's a fear spike. And the fear spike is contagious to the market and produces a contagion of sell-offs of financial panic. And I think that's a really natural application of this, and I'm working in a couple of ways. That's one. I think another one is vaccine refusal in the health sphere. You know, if people think, you know, they're told vaccine is perfectly safe, and then true or false, they get reports that it produces autism. That's surprising and salient, and it also produces a contagion of vaccine refusal. You know, and again, we've seen the application to violence. So I think in areas like violence, health, financial dynamics, it's very promising. And again, I think again, this is a theoretical exercise. And in that book, I didn't purport to fit it to any actual data, but we're now doing it. And I think it's very promising. And, you know.
So I like this idea because it's, for instance, that's a nice attitude in the sense, it reminds me about this idea that as in the complex adaptive system, things that you start with a model and then you try to understand if this model can be generalizable across different kind of contexts, explaining different or capturing similar properties in different kind of contexts. Whereas, for instance, for many people in many cognitive psychologists like Giger Renzer kind of thing, they work in another way. So they believe that probably there are heuristics were very much context specific. So they probably the line is about building taxonomy of context specific heuristics or rules that are jointly combined with the context. So they believe this kind of, and so very much context specific. It seems that you were thinking on the other way around. So instead of collecting a taxonomy of context-specific rules or models of actors, you are trying to do the other way around, which is starting from a very simple and abstract type of theory of a model actor, and then trying to understand if this can explain a different type of phenomena, and so that's
Exactly.
it's a different
Totally, exactly right. But I think, you know, I think theory in the history of science, it works in various ways. I mean, you know, Tycho Brahe started with huge data, and Kepler was able to derive equations explaining the data. But I mean, in other you know, instances, the theory really precedes the data. The theory tells you what data to go collect. I mean, Maxwell's theory is my maybe favorite example, is where, you know, electromagnetic theory was produced, and mathematically it showed, look, there should be electromagnetic radiation, radio waves. And then Hertz went out and found radio waves. Higgs boson, same thing. Einstein relativity, light should bend in a gravitational way, or under curvature of a space-time manifold. And then Eddington had to go out and make that measurement. So a lot of the big advances have been theory first. They tell you what data to collect, and then by various means, you know, people find creative ways to collect that data. And I think that's, you know, that might be where we are. People might collect the data and say, well, you're all wet. You collected the data, the 8 and 0 is better. But the point is, I think as a methodology, it's perfectly acceptable to build a theory and then see what its explanatory range really is. You don't have to start with a bunch of data and run regressions.
Yeah, very good. There's a question from the audience. Francesco. Yeah.
Thank you for the brilliant talk. I was wondering, I mean, to me, this idea of agent zero is appealing because somehow the differential assumption with typical behavioral model of contagion is that fear or emotion are more easily observable than behavior, in particular in some type of context. For instance, if I think in finance, it's much more easier to see that something is going wrong with the portfolio of a trader in my floor by looking at his or her face, rather than knowing exactly what he or she is trading. Might be something like this. So I was wondering, do you think there is some sort of value in trying to rebuild the same famous models that were developed with behavioral contagion, something like this, or behavioral imitation, using this agent zero framework to see differentials, equifinality, if you can explain more. So the typical ABM stuff, say. I don't know if you see value in rebuilding this model.
Absolutely.
Your framework.
Yeah, I mean, there can be competing explanations.
Yeah.
And then we have to figure out which one should deserve privacy by inventing new experiments or collecting new data. I mean, as I say, generative social science says, you know, if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. but there might be several ways to grow it. And there we have a standard problem where theories are competing. We have to figure out empirical ways to adjudicate between them. But absolutely, I think that'd be great. I welcome you to do that.
Any question here? Raffaele,
Thank you. This was really inspiring. As you were talking about the Arab Spring, for example, or other empirical examples, something that came to my mind is it possible, have you thought about important things that may be unaccounted for in this agent zero model, such as collective action, like people? It doesn't seem to me in any of your instances of the model that there's a way that people can explicitly coordinate and cooperate to achieve a common goal, so sort of collective deliberation, or norms, so the emergence of norms that persist above and beyond individual or some disposition. So if you have encountered things that, the question is, have you encountered any of these things that are not in the model, or maybe have you thought about ways that this model could incorporate those things?
Yeah, those are very good questions, and I think you're right. The norms per se are not really in this picture. And again, the first one was, collective actual deliberation. Now there, I think the jury trial is a collective result. I mean, they end up with a unanimous verdict, although, and again, they have a goal. I mean, the goal is to decide whether the person is guilty or not. But it's not like, 1,000 people building the pyramids. That's true. And I think those would be interesting and fruitful extensions, as would the introduction of norms, or see why do norms happen? Why do networks happen? Why did norms happen? And there could be some ability of the group to censure people who don't adopt them. There's meta-norms, and Bob Axelrod's famous would be all. So again, those are very good questions. I don't have clean answers. I think they're very useful ideas for extending models. Yeah.
This is Eduardo. Yeah.
Thanks for the lecture. Yeah, I was wondering if you've come across other possible applications of agent zero in the economics domain, because the critique of the rational actor model comes a lot from economics, where there's a very large heterodox literature with post-Keynesians or evolutionary economics already dealing with similar issues. And then besides financial markets or contagions, where this really seems to be a close fit, I'm imagining if there's other applications from heterodox economics where this could be.
Sure. I mean, well, first I should say, people like Blake LeBaron and Cars Holm are pushing this very hard and very successfully. And in his own way, Giovanni Dossi is also. But I think other phenomena, again, housing crashes are another very good example, where again, you get some unexpected shock and you get the propagation of a behavior, sell-offs, things like this. But I think economics is full of this. I mean, financial markets certainly, there's a lot of work on financial contagion, but probably other things as well. I'm trying to think of probably the fluid dynamics.
Maybe, I'm thinking macroeconomics, there might be some things to do.
I think, I mean, Blake has this whole handbook. Heterogeneous agent.
Right.
That you're familiar with, I'm sure.
I'll have a look at the literature with this in mind, I think.
Good.
Now.
Let me know when you find.
Yes.
Any other question? Yeah? Melissa.
Josh, you've talked here a lot about effectively antisocial behavior, violence, sell-offs, et cetera, et cetera. If you were trying to use Agent Zero to model pro-social behavior, how would you do that? How different would it be? What would you have to adjust to get the negativity bias out of Agent Zero?
That's a great question. Very good question. And it's a very hard one. And part of the trick of Agent Zero is we have these equations for fear acquisition. You'd need different equations, different picture for, and in the book, I play with this. Perhaps, I take some license in playing with it. But yeah, in situations like, I wouldn't be the first person to join the choir. But when enough people joined, I joined the choir. Things like these, there's modeling by Scott Page on the standing ovation problem. I wouldn't be the first to stand, but I joined the ovation. That's not exactly fear, but it is some type of transmission of confidence or other emotional state. So I think the general picture of an emotional state, a deliberative module, and social connection goes over to the happy stories, but you need to replace the fear module as a mathematical object with some other picture of the spread of confidence that I should sing, or confidence that I should join the ovation, or join the protest, or other sorts of things.
And of course, conformity.
And conformity, right? Although that's a little bit implicit in the homophily network weights. But yeah, very good question. All open for progress. Thank you.
I see a couple of questions in the chat. So Shivan was asking, he was, or she, I don't know, sorry, case, about in what cases, in which sense your results are different than from emulation. I guess probably because there's an explanation.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, if you mean by emulation, right. I mean, again, in the equations, nobody observes the other agent's action. They just experience the other person's disposition. So they're not imitating overt observable behavior at all. So I think that's one sense in which, that's one answer to the question. What was the rest of it? Was
John was asking.
No, the woman who just the person, yeah. What I meant, okay, so first of all,
Results. Yeah.
So, all right, so I see, I misunderstood your question. Mainly when I talked about emulation earlier, I talked about AI and large language models and things like this, and this Turing test idea, where you could emulate the sound of the soprano without telling me anything about how sopranos vocalize. Similarly, an LLM will emulate the human construction of phonetic strings, but it gives no account of how humans acquire the grammar, which is definitely not by error correction at all. So emulate in that sense, I meant that I want to give a mechanism and not just emulate the output. That was the point there. And I think AI, all of these areas are doing a great job emulating output, but not in a way that reveals the human generative mechanism. That was my point. And this model, crude and provisional, does give some account of the mechanism underlying observable behavior.
Okay, it was before giving the space to Francesco online, so that John was asking if this kind of instead of representing probabilities of experience of specific events in terms of time instead of location.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's another extension that would be fine. I mean, I think that's a perfectly good idea. And the location is in the model, but you're not forming a probability that things will happen somewhere. You're forming a probability that something will happen in my immediate neighborhood. But yeah, there could be all sorts of clustering phenomena and attraction and repulsion from clusters, all sorts of extensions. Very good idea. If that's what you mean.
So Francesco, no, you're not Francesco. Ciao, my friend.
Thank you. This is Francesco from Poland. I have probably the stupidest question. First of all, thank you for fantastic lecture and fantastic book. And my stupid question is, you showed us dynamics on 3 agents. Do you find any difference if the population of agents is bigger? Let's say if you have 500,000 of agents, 30 agent, is there any difference in principle? Also in agent 0, it means that more is different?
Nice question. I haven't done huge experiments with agent 0, although one of the pieces of the agenda is I have built these very large planetary scale infectious disease models and evacuation models. I'll show those next time if maybe you can come. And, you know, those are models in the billion of agent range. I mean, the global pandemic model has 6 billion individual agents. And it's hard competition to populate large models with agents that have any real sophistication, like Agent Zero does, although we're overcoming that. And I see a day when we'll have national scale models, other very large scale models populated by agents like this. My own very small experiments would indicate that the general phenomena, you know, again, I think this is an open and very good and important question. If we're interested in a phenomenon like agents going without stimulus, that does scale up. That little movie might have indicated. I don't know how many agents were there, but it's very easy to scale this up to, you know, tens of thousands of agents and see if those things apply. And I don't quite know. I think that'd be a very important exercise to just scale the theoretical model, identify the behaviors of interest, and see if they're preserved, or if, as you say, more is different.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, Josh? So, Josh, thank you very much for this first lecture. So I remind you there's two lectures still, and next one is on Monday. Yeah, Alpha 4 will be about the inverse generative social science idea, and so we see each other next time. So thank you again, Josh, for this presentation. Thank you guys online. Hope you appreciate. We will. We have been recording the lectures. So if Josh agrees, of course, we'll send around to the lectures. So see you on Monday. Thank you.